Good morning. It's a Thursday, September 29th. This is the Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Ken Kelly. With me, as always, big game, James Fraley. How are we this morning, James?
I'm good. Final day of the quarter. Ready for fall. Pumpkin spice time. Let's go. Let's get it.
Final day of the quarter. Today's only the 29th. Isn't the final day of the quarter tomorrow?
You know what? Just roll with me on it.
Do we need to start over? So what we try to do on this show is educate people about the changing landscape of the world, and people probably just don't know that September now has only 29 days. So that's where we're at today. So we are a fountain of incredible information. That's just how we operate. That's for sure. Anyway, this is the Fantasy Basketball Podcast. We're going to have new episodes every Thursday now coming out. So every Thursday we're going to have these ready for your listening enjoyment. We've got all of our social stuff set up now as well. So that's what the kids do these days, James. So that's what the kids and anybody who actually wants people to listen to them, I think that's what they do. So follow us on Twitter. It's at @the_FB pod. On Instagram, it's all lowercase, _fantasy_basketball_podcast.
That's going to be tough to remember.
It really, yeah, it is. It's the underscores that I think are pretty tough, but we'll see how that goes. We also have a newsletter, and newsletter's free. So sign up, DM us on Instagram, Twitter, give us a follow. That's all we're asking for right now. So if you could do that, it would be fantastic for us. So we're going to talk today about Media Day. So what happened at Media Day, and what did we learn? And then also we're going to talk a lot about drafting strategies today as well. So drafting strategies certainly is, I think it's a hot topic. I think it's something that's very relevant right now because there are a lot of things certainly going on in terms of research and what we're trying to do. So it's a really good time to start talking about just some general drafting strategies before upcoming drafts. So we're going to start with some breaking fantasy news, though. So Lonzo Ball, the great Lonzo Ball, is going to be – he's hurt. So the Bulls doctors are a little baffled right now. He still has a lot of pain running and jumping. It's really odd. So there's even talk that he's having trouble, like, going up and down stairs. So, I mean, I have trouble going up and down stairs, but the problem is I'm 46 and overweight. So I'm not an athlete who is looking to play basketball for the Bulls this year. So it's kind of an odd thing going on with him. I know that Shams put out something today that the doctors are optimistic that he is going to indeed play this season. But it's really going to be hard to say. So what are your thoughts just kind of on the injury, and what have you learned so far, James?
If you're drafting, kind of keep him in your pocket. I don't know that I pick him, obviously, just because when a player says that he's experiencing pain post-injury, that raises a lot of red flags to me, especially if there's conflicting information between what the team doctors are saying and then kind of the mindset of the athlete. Having said that, you definitely don't want to be that guy who leaves him on the waiver wire and then he starts to kind of progress and there's a possibility that he's going to play, which should be right around, towards the tail end, closer to playoffs for fantasy. This guy in 2021 put up just under 15 points a game, 5 rebounds, almost 6 assists, 1.5 steals. Shooting clips are okay. You don't want to leave him on the wire because he will get you fantasy baskets. So keep your ears to the pavement on this one because he could bring some real value and he could be the deciding factor. When they talk about in the NBA, this guy could be the guy who pushes you over the edge. If you're kind of on the cusp and you're able to pick Lonzo Ball up, he's got about 3 weeks out. You pick him up in an injury waiver wire pick up and just let him sit. That could end up, make or break in your season. So definitely a big asset sitting out there. I wouldn't suggest you draft him. There's other guys that you're going to need for the first 2.5 months of the season, but keep an eye on him for later in the season for sure.
Do you think that changes the prospects of some of these other players on the Bulls, like DeMar DeRozan specifically, with him being out?
Well, an interesting article came out today that I read that, and the timing of it's funny. about how DeMar DeRozan was pretty dead set on going to the Lakers. I mean, he was all but locked up, and then they signed Russell Westbrook, and he just kind of scratched his head about it. So I don't know why you would put that kind of information out and that type of article out. As soon as the season starts, Russell Westbrook's contract is an expiring one, and it sounds like Rob Pelinka has given LeBron kind of the heads up that, since he signed the extension, LeBron that is, that the probability of them moving those 2 draft picks that they have for 27 and 28 are pretty high. And you package that with somebody like Russell Westbrook's contract. If Lonzo Ball's not playing, the Bulls are still going to be a potential playoff team. They're going to need a point guard, a dynamic scorer. So I just wonder whether or not something like that comes to fruition where you move DeMar over. I mean, it's definitely not a long-term play for the Lakers. I feel bad for them after like 3 years of this. They're going to be just trash for a while, but just look for talks to intensify between the Bulls and the Lakers on a Russell Westbrook move.
Yeah, that would be something to see for sure. Who knows what's going to happen down the road with Westbrook? It's still a story. It's going to be a story up until it's not a story. So we'll just kind of stay tuned on that front. But that's not the only injury right now. There is another one that's really significant, both in fantasy and reality, and that's Robert Williams III. So he was initially slated to return in 4 to 6 weeks. That's been moved back to 8 to 12 now. So he's such a good asset. I think we had him ranked right around number 10 in terms of centers this year. But boy, he's looking like a riskier pick by the day. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, what was glaring about this was the 8 to 12 weeks is before he can start basketball activities. So that, I mean, even if he stays in shape and he's working out, his cardio's got to be, you got to get in basketball playing shape. So as a coach, I mean, you're well aware of this. You're looking at probably, 15 days just for the cardio aspect of it. And if you haven't done, you move from 2v2, 3v3 to 5v5, you might be able to expedite that, but that's really pushing you past Christmas time, first part of the year. So he's another one of those guys that I think you have to, unlike Lonzo Ball, I think you draft Robert Williams later in the round or late rounds just because you don't want to leave him sitting. Somebody's got to pick him up and just let him sit on an IR spot. But I'm concerned this is multiple instances in which this knee is kind of messed with Robert Williams, and I think this might be a prolonged career-defining injury for him. So either he's going to be able to play through it or not. He's going to have this hit and miss. But as far as the season's concerned, I don't see him being left on the wire like Lonzo will be. But I definitely wouldn't touch him until late round.
No, it's just such a premier position. I just don't see him being somebody who's going to be left out there just to kind of sit. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see exactly what happens kind of moving forward with him. I would be the guy who probably takes him, later in the draft and just stashes him just to see what we're going to get. But it's getting almost riskier by the day. So let's go ahead and talk about Media Day. Media Day has come and gone, and there were some important news and notes that happened as we went through the day. I would say let's start with the Brooklyn Nets and Kyrie Irving. So Kyrie is always one of the most polarizing players to talk about. This is our 5th episode, and I think we've already spent probably 30 or 40 minutes on Kyrie, which might be 30 or 40 minutes too long, but I digress. Kyrie said there's lots of reflection this season, which is no surprise, but his reflection was actually about basketball, which might be a surprise. He said that he left the court embarrassed, watched a ton of film, got to know the players and staff this season a little bit better, said the KD trade request was awkward. He also said something I think that was pretty telling, that he actually found out about it on social media. So this thought that KD and Kyrie are super tight may not actually be true. I think it's just kind of weird with him. I don't know what to think of it. Kyrie is always obviously one of the most polarizing players. But what were your thoughts from his comments?
I was looking for Kyrie to come out and kind of have an FU season to prove everybody wrong, and I was hoping any reflection that he had from the season would motivate him to come out and say, "We're about." It just I wanted things to come out of his mouth that were more in line with, this is about basketball. We're going to win. All the noise is behind us. We're not going to let that kind of jeopardize where we're going, and that really wasn't what it was from anybody on that roster, and I thought that was pretty telling. So I don't know that I walk away from listening to his comments thinking that he's motivated to go out and be a monster this season. So from a roster perspective, Brooklyn should, be one of the top 3 teams in the East. I don't know. I just didn't get the motivation from him or Ben Simmons or Kevin Durant. They just kind of seemed very laissez-faire about the whole thing, which, media day is an obligation that, they're required to go and get dressed up and shoot pictures. I'm sure it's not something that anybody, pines for, but I didn't walk away feeling enthused by anybody who spoke on behalf of the Nets at all.
No, it was odd, and there was some talk after media day was over. Steve Nash came out and said that he doesn't care if Ben Simmons doesn't shoot at all season, which I thought was likely a little bit overprotective, but I get it. Durant said he was not surprised that he wasn't traded, which may or may not be true. I'm not really sure on that front. I think that Durant likely is saying that he wasn't surprised because he wants to save face a little bit. I really feel like he felt like once he put himself out there that every team in the world would just be clamoring for his services, and it really just didn't happen. So not that KD isn't a player who everybody would love to have on their team, but I just the trade package that would have had to come back to the Nets would have been so extreme. It just would have been impossible for them to move him. So interesting from the Nets. I think they're a team that nobody really knows what to expect. Nobody knows what we're going to get from them, and I think it's going to be a fun season just watching them either explode or implode. And honestly, I don't think anybody knows exactly what that's going to be.
Well,
so let's go ahead and move on.
Before we move forward, I just want to ask you a question. So this has been something that's been asked to me. Multiple people have asked, where would I take Ben Simmons in my draft? So where do you think Ben Simmons lands from a drafting category? Like, what, statistically speaking, what are you looking at from somebody like Ben this year?
I think he is one of the toughest players to gauge. If he's right, I think that what you get from him in terms of rebounds, assists, steals, the defensive counting stats that he's going to get are going to be certainly good enough to have in your lineup. I don't know where I would take him. Honestly, he's one of those guys who I'm just going to fade in drafts because I just don't trust him. So if you're sitting there in the middle rounds and you're looking for one of those home run players to take, he would be one to do that with. But for me, I'm just going to kind of put him on my do not draft list and let somebody else take the plunge.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't think he's going to need to score, and I think that he's going to have so much attention elsewhere that he should be able to walk into 15 points. He'll probably, because they don't have a center, he'll probably be their second leading rebounder. Assist-wise, if he's facilitating the offense, he's not going to play back to the basket. So I'm thinking he's got to be close to 7 assists, and he shoots inside the three-point line. I mean, you're talking close to like 49, almost 50%. From a fantasy perspective, that's third round, fourth round value. So if he's sitting there in that fourth round, I may snag him. I don't know. I'm feeling good about him. I don't feel good about the team, but I feel good that even if with a bad attitude, and if the morale of the team's bad, if he's healthy, he just walks into stats so easily. So, and he was a juggernaut before in Philadelphia before this whole thing kind of went sideways. So, anyway, I was just curious on your take on that. So, but like I said, there isn't a wrong spot to take him unless you're taking him in the first 3 rounds. I think you're safe if you're taking him from the 4th round on. But we can move forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And we're going to talk a lot about drafting strategies today. And we'll talk about risk reward certainly as we move forward. And he's one of those players who fits into that risk reward category without a doubt. So let's talk about the Suns. There, this is weird.
This is
Really weird.
scary to me. This was very telling.
Yeah, DeAndre Ayton is basically saying that he hasn't talked to Monty Williams at all since he was benched in the last game of the playoffs. Now, remember, Ayton is a player who signed a giant offer sheet, 4 years, $132.9 million with the Pacers. Looked like a player who wanted to go. There was talk that the Suns may not basically match the offer, but they ended up doing it anyway. And they did it quickly. So I don't think the Suns really even thought about it. It was just a no-brainer to them. They wanted him back. But I think they probably expected a little bit more excitement from Ayton. He looks like a player who is really unhappy after getting a giant bag of cash. So I don't know. There just seems to be some resentment. There seems to be some anger. There just seems to be there are some problems that need to be worked out between Monty and DeAndre before this season starts, or this thing could get really messy.
Yeah, we had DeAndre Ayton as our seventh center when we did our rankings. I project him to have a strong season. I'm of a different mindset when it comes to how the contract played out. Phoenix didn't make an offer because I don't think Phoenix looked at him as a guy who we should pay $132 million if nobody else was willing to pay him $132 million. So then when Indy goes and gives him the offer, they had to match it, obviously, because you don't let a guy like that walk, because how do you justify it, because you didn't package him in a trade. So I think Aiden took that as a slight, like, hey, you didn't even want anything to do with me. You didn't want to give me $132 million. You gave that to me begrudgingly because Indy said that they were willing to give it to me. So I get that frustration. And Monty Williams tried to downplay it by saying, I haven't talked to several of the players on the team since the playoffs. I just find that very difficult to believe. But I've always been a guy that says go with your gut, and a lot can be said without being said at all verbally. And the body language of DeAndre Ayton was absolutely just frustrated. Like, I don't want to talk about it. You could just tell he was saying a lot with his body language, his facial expressions. His answers were very, 1, 2, 3 words. This is a guy who he naturally looks older than he is. He's got that Greg Oden, LeBron type facial structure to him, but he did not look happy to be there. He did not look happy or excited about, the team. And last year, Phoenix was the best regular season team. Yes, they kind of, I wouldn't even say fell apart. I just think they got beat up pretty good in those two series. So, I would think there'd be more excitement going into a season where now you're not worrying about your contract. You know that they're committed to you. I just think that Aiden's kind of frustrated about the way they went about it. But then that parlays over to Chris Paul, and everything that I saw from Chris Paul, it was almost as if Chris Paul was using the Robert Sarver situation. So, more or less forced out of the NBA to sell the Phoenix Suns. It looked like he was parlaying some of his emotions and frustrations to the Sarver situation. And I think that's kind of a smoke and mirrors thing. I just didn't see any enthusiasm from Monty Williams, from Devin Booker, from Chris Paul, or Ayton. And that's a telling sign to me for a team that, is projected to be, for all intents and purposes, a top 4 team in the West next year. I just think the chemistry, something happened there that's broke, and it's going to take a little bit to fix it.
Well, we talk a lot in football about the Super Bowl hangover. It looks like there's a regular season hangover with this team. They just really don't seem very enthused about anything. So it's going to be a storyline to watch, I think, at the beginning of the season. Do they come out and struggle? Who is to blame for those struggles? What actually happens with this group when they hit the floor again? Are they going to be engaged and ready to play? Or are they going to be, a team that is looking for excuses, be it, a contract issue or age or Robert Sarver or, whatever it might be. But I think that there's a little bit of smoke coming from the Suns facility right now that is at least unnerving. So let's move on. I can't believe that we're actually talking about facial structure, but I don't think that there's another podcast out there that would actually break down players' facial structure.
You
like
tell
we
me you
do.
don't think DeAndre Ayton looks older than he is?
I think he looks older than he is, but I'm not a doctor. Like I'm not going to say, well, this is the facial structure of a player, and this is what makes him look old.
Him and Greg
So
Oden both look 30 years older than they actually are. So whatever that is, maybe we don't want to use facial structure, but they just look like old men. So whatever that is, I don't know. But there's a similarity between the two guys. So that's I
no,
guess that's what I meant.
that's fair. No, I was actually at a claim jumper restaurant in like outside of Portland. It was probably about a month or two after Greg Oden was initially drafted, and he walked into that place, and that is one large human being. And even then, you could like you look at him and you think, okay, you haven't been carded since you were like, I mean, you like 10 years old. So yeah, it's a weird deal with him for sure. So yeah, and I can see that with Aiden. It does look very similar. So let's move on to the Pelicans. Pelicans are a team that we've talked a lot about. A team that is definitely building for the future. A team that is kind of poised to make a big jump. Unlike the Suns, they seem like a team that is very enthusiastic about the season. And I think a lot of that comes from how Zion Williamson looks right now. So now, granted, this is a 5-on-5 workout. This is not Game 7 of the NBA Finals, but for all intents and purposes, it looks like Zion was absolutely dominant when he hit the floor again. And guys are saying, "Hey, Zion looks like Zion again." And if that's the case, we have ourselves an even tougher decision in drafts.
Yeah, Zion is my Christian Bale of the league. That guy goes through body transformations like no one I've ever seen. But he looked.
Okay, stop. So you can't tell me that Christian. Okay, we're gonna go off the rails. I don't care. You can't tell me that Christian Bale goes through body transformations in a better or more dramatic way than Matthew McConaughey.
Did you see The Machinist?
Did you see the Dallas?
Yes, I did. Go. I challenge you to go look at The Machinist. I would say easily, but I could get to where Matthew McConaughey did in Dallas Buyers Club versus The Machinist. He weighed like $115 or something like that, and then to go from that into having to bulk up for Batman, that is just crazy what they do to their bodies. So yes, I'm gonna stick with Christian Bale. I mean, maybe
No
a
way.
close second to McConaughey, but hey,
McConaughey got down to it looked like 90 pounds.
yeah,
Like he was down to like 90 pounds, and then he had to like bulk up just to do Lincoln commercials.
oh,
Like I don't
to roll
I
a
don't
booger?
see.
Stop.
Yeah, no, I don't see Christian Bale even in the same ballpark as Matthew McConaughey in terms of body changes.
You need to
so
look.
that's
You need to look up The Machinist. Anyway, I will
I've
say
seen
this.
no, I've seen. Okay, I'm just gonna say I'm not gonna like harp on this for too long, but now you've struck a chord in me this morning. Okay, so we're gonna put a poll question out there, and it's gonna be who has more dramatic body changes for acting parts, Christian Bale or Matthew McConaughey.
Oh, and you
I will-
totally forgot that Christian Bale went up to like almost 300 pounds to play Dick Cheney. Show me a role where Matthew McConaughey bloated up to almost 300 pounds. So you go from
That
like
was it.
That was a huge. That wasn't CGI. That was him eating. That was
It
him.
wasn't-
Christian Bale is a
Was it
method actor.
CGI? No, it wasn't CGI. It was a fat suit.
It wasn't a fat suit.
Bro,
Oh
no,
my
no,
gosh.
no.
You know what?
No, it was a
Put
fat
the
suit. It was a
survey
Dick
up.
Cheney fat suit.
Put the
No, it was
survey
a
up.
Dick Cheney. No, I could for Halloween this year. I could easily be Dick Cheney fat suit, and look exactly like Christian Bale did. And all
Okay.
I'd have to do is go out to Amazon and buy a Dick Cheney fat suit.
Well, let's rate it back in. Look, Zion looked fantastic. I get excited, and the more I read, and this is like the complete opposite of what happened in Phoenix and in Brooklyn. Everything coming out of New Orleans camp is getting me excited, and I'm a Trailblazer fan through and through. But I'm telling you, I'm rooting for the Pelicans. I love everything about how their team is set up. I'm excited. I don't know if you saw that meme that's going around that had CJ McCollum is talking to Zion, and David Griffin's in the back, and he just has this real, just melancholy smile watching these two guys talk. It's almost like he's thirst trapping for Zion. It's such a great image. I'm gonna post it when we get done with this, but I am excited for the Pelicans season. Like I said, you had said in I think the last episode they're 5,000 or the plus 5,000 to win the championship this year. I'm probably gonna throw a little bit of money on that just for the sake of I want to root for them. I want to give them something to kind of play for, and if I can make a little money on the side, I'll do that. But everything coming out
Okay,
of camp
so
gets me
so
excited.
that's a bold statement. Okay, that you're gonna so, and it's also an abstract. So when you say a little bit of money, you talking like a dollar?
I'm talking like
You
50
talking?
bucks.
You put $50 down on the Pelicans at plus 5,000.
I'll put 50 bucks on the Pelicans. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. All right. So we're gonna move forward, and when I was looking through the show notes, sometimes our personalities just come through, and your hatred for Jimmy Butler is so extreme. He is like the Bizarro James of the world. Like you put like honestly like, and I should post this on the internet out there just so people can see it. You put in here, quote, his hairdo is more or less trolling the
He
internet.
said as much. So it's not like I did it. They asked him. That was one of the hot button questions because he has, it's almost, in RIP to Coolio, who was an absolute pillar from a music perspective of our generation growing up. But yeah, Jimmy
What
Butler.
did you think? What about his facial, like his facial structure too,
No, I'm
or
just
just
saying,
his
like,
hair?
for those who didn't know, Coolio passed away. That's a big deal. But no, I think Jimmy had it in rows, and I think he only had five of them, five dreads, and he's thinking about keeping it for the season. And then if you could look back, he's had different hairdos each of the last 5 seasons. This one is by far kind of the most flamboyant and out there, and he more or less says he does it to make the Twitter mob upset and things like that. And I don't know, it's just obnoxious things like that. I don't care if you wear your hair like that. Um, I don't know. You're right. It it just never seems like something that comes out of his mouth is something that I like root for. I haven't in a long time. So maybe I should just stay off the Jimmy Butler bandwagon. I'm just gonna I'm done talking with him. Hard stop on the 5th episode. I'm done talking about Jimmy.
Well, it's like the anti bandwagon. You're an anti bandwagon Jimmy Butler guy. Like you're standing in front of the bandwagon, like a guy in front of a tank. So yeah, it's just not going to happen. And really, I don't like to spend much time talking about anybody's hair because I don't have any. I haven't had a haircut, and I think, well, an official haircut. Like I shave my own head, so I would say an official haircut since probably 2012. So whenever we talk about hair, it's just not really something that is interesting to me. So that's probably why I just missed it on what Jimmy was saying. Okay, so when we move on here, one more little piece of information from Media Day. James Harden was doing some tongue-in-cheek stuff and said that he lost 100 pounds this offseason. Don't think that's really true, but he did say he put the focus on muscle mass and endurance and looks to be in good shape moving forward. So again, we talk about Harden and Zion as being two of the most polarizing players in all of fantasy basketball, and they're saying and doing the right things so far. So what are your thoughts on Harden's comments?
Yeah, I mean Harden from a fantasy standpoint has been top 5 the last 10 seasons. Um, if he's truly focused on his weight and his health and his muscles and his endurance, and Philadelphia is trying to make a push because I think they're done with this, kind of meandering around that 1 through 4 range. They want to play in the Eastern Conference Finals. They want to get an opportunity to play for a championship. Harden has an opportunity to be again in that top 10 for fantasy value. So I'd be excited. I'm definitely going to snag Harden if he's available. Maybe not with my first 5 picks, but I'm going to try to snag Harden. That's just something I always try to do. He walks into stats, so that's a good thing for anybody who's is on the fence on thinking, well, what kind of Harden am I going to get this year? I take it with a grain of salt to a degree because I think he said that multiple times, but you could tell in his conversation that he had made kind of a subtle jab at the whole Brooklyn situation that for a year and a half it was just kind of tumultuous and it didn't really have any direction. He knows what he wants right now. He wants to win a championship. And I don't think that was the mindset in Brooklyn, which is it all kind of comes back to I don't think that Brooklyn is set up to win a championship because I don't think they have the mind right to win a championship. So look for Harden to have a big season. I'm excited if he's available to me late in the first round or on the flop. I'm going to grab him.
Yeah, again, this goes back to risk and reward, and it really segues pretty nicely into our next segment here, and that's really an open discussion about strategy. So, we wrote down some different things about how to go through team building and how to attack a draft, and some things here are really important for people to understand. The first one is really knowing your competition. How much do they study? What kind of resources do they use? How much basketball do they know? How much basketball do they watch? Because I think it's really easy when you have different free agents and players move teams, and you just, I think people make assumptions that their production is just going to stay the same. So we talked a lot about DeJounte Murray and what's going to happen with him moving to Atlanta. I think that's a perfect case in point. So are people really thinking about what that's going to do from a fantasy perspective, both in San Antonio and in Atlanta? Or are they just essentially looking at the name, looking at the production from last year, and assuming it's going to be the same? So, there's kind of that saying in poker that if you don't know who the sucker is in the room, it's probably you. So obviously, you need to do your homework. You need to really take some time and understand not just the rules and scoring format that we'll talk about as we move forward, but also what kind of people you're playing with. So, I mean, are these the types of people who just pick up a fantasy rag at the grocery store or go online and grab something and just use that and just go chalk? We've talked a lot about drafts not being won or lost in, or drafts really, they're not won in the first 3 rounds, but they can be lost there. So I think it's really important to understand who you're playing with and what kind of research they really do.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. So the difference with fantasy basketball versus fantasy football, and it's just when people play fantasy football, they're diehards. Very seldom or very rarely will you find a fantasy football league where if it's a 12-player league where you've got 2 or 3 people that are just kind of passively playing and they don't really care, and they set their lineups, for the next 3 weeks in a row, and then they walk away from it. You do get that more in basketball, and I think part of the reason why I want to do this podcast is to introduce people to it, realize that it's not difficult. There's a lot of fun to be had, especially with your buddies and friends. It is a little bit more passive, but there are guys in some more serious leagues that they'll pick their roster and then they're dead set. They don't make any moves. They don't make any adjustments. They just ride or die. And then you have some that pick their roster with the intent of half of it being moved. So they're the guys who are peddling trades, right out of the gate. Neither one of those scenarios is necessarily better than the other, depending on how you pick. But you just want to know what people are in your group, especially if we've talked about this in the last 4 episodes. There might be guys that I take that I really want them for the first 3.5 months of the season. But then if load management starts to set in, I kind of want to move them before load management kicks in. That's just being savvy to how the league works. If I'm with a bunch of guys who don't want to do any trades, well, then I may not take that player. So Anthony Davis, for instance. I may not take him just because I won't have the ability to move him later. But if I'm in a league where I know guys are willing to look at offers and trades, and I can draft differently. So it is important. And also, Ken and I have actually been in leagues where both he and I at 12:01 are on the waiver wire trying to pick guys up and drop guys. We're getting close to the playoffs. How many people are going to be willing to do that? How many people are going to be smart enough to know to grab Lonzo Ball 3 weeks before he comes back and put him on an IR reserve? Just things like that. Know your competition, just like you would want to know who you're playing with if you're on a court. So that actually is one of the most pivotal things to do when you step into a league, is to be familiar with the guys you're playing with.
Well, and I think that's one of the fun things about doing this podcast with you too. So as we move forward into the season, we're going to be able to tell the listeners out there some of the things we're thinking about in terms of strategy and gameplay. So we'll talk about Lonzo Ball when he's 3 weeks or 4 weeks ahead of schedule, and talk about strategies and what we should do. We'll talk about trade targets and how you should formulate different trades, how you should approach a trade. All those things that are really, really important you might be able to throw out some good 2-for-1s out there and get some good players in return. So we'll talk so much about all that stuff as we move forward in the season. I'm excited for it. I think it's going to be a ton of fun. So the next note on our list here was really all about scoring models. And every league is not created the same. And I think for those people who are just getting into fantasy basketball, may not necessarily understand that. You really need to understand your scoring format and how it works. Are there multipliers out there? Uh, every league is not created the same again. So you really need to understand, how positions work, which positions are more important based on the scoring model, and then go through and really create your own set of rankings, because it is not one size fits all. And it's interesting because I think fantasy basketball is even more complicated at times in terms of some of the different scoring formats than fantasy football is. I think that's what makes it fun. I think that's what makes it challenging. But you certainly do need to understand that. So any additional thoughts on that point, James?
So I usually play in 8 and 9 category leagues. So essentially what that means is you're getting your traditional shooting percentage splits. You have your points, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks. In a 9 category league, they take into consideration turnovers. In an 8 cat, they don't. So the differences in most leagues is whether or not they offer multipliers, and we've talked about that a few times. If you get a double-double, you get a multiplier. So maybe you get 1.5 extra points for that. And if it's a triple-double, you make it 3 extra points. So multipliers allow you to make up some of the difference if your person doesn't shoot a lot of 3-pointers. So if you're getting a post, so take Clint Capella, for instance. If he gets you double-doubles, but he's not going to shoot any threes. Where a lot of people get caught up is they try to find somebody who's got a pepper all of them, and that's next to impossible. So Ken's used this term quite a few times, and if you're not familiar with it, it's called punting. So essentially, if you punt on a category, that's saying I'm fine with a guy having a horrible 3-point shooting percentage, right? But he gets me a lot of blocks and steals, and typically, like points, for instance, are usually in most leagues are a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you guy scores 10 points in the game, you get 10 fantasy points for it. Steals and blocks, because those are more difficult, if they get 1 steal in a game, you might get 1.5 points. In some multipliers I've played in where I'm actually getting 2 points for every steal. So if I get a guy who gives me 3 steals and I get 2 points per steal, I get 6 right there, right? So I can rack up fantasy value even if my guy only averages 12 points versus a guy who gives me 26 points. So being familiar with your points system, that's very important. And you can go into your settings, whatever league you're in. You don't have to be the commissioner. And sometimes it's open discussion you can have with the commissioner when it comes to the scoring model, especially if you're playing with a bunch of buddies. So, have that be something you guys vote on. But just be familiar with your point system, because that's how you want to draft. And be comfortable punting away some statistical categories, because you're very seldom will you find a guy who hits them all across the board, and that guy's usually gone within the first 3 picks.
No, those are good words for sure. I think that you really do need to have a good understanding in order to formulate a good strategy, because it is not one size fits all. So the next tip we had on here is really knowing your season dates and playoff schedule. So how does that really line up with the NBA playoffs? And I think the point to note there is really, do you have players who are going to be resting? Do you have a team that is loaded with guys who are going to be on load management restrictions? Because the fantasy playoffs are certainly, the key part of the season. You build, through October, November, December, January, you keep building to position yourself to win. But you see this so many times in fantasy basketball where somebody creates a really good regular season team, and then they're just not prepared for the playoffs because they have guys who are just not ready. And they don't look at the schedule. They don't look and see, how many games do these teams play in the last 2, 3, 4 weeks of the season. So there is an importance to really understanding the nuances of the NBA schedule, which makes this very unique and very different. I think this is really why fantasy baseball and fantasy basketball are a little bit more complicated, not to mention just the effort that you have to put in to prepare and be good at it. But you really do need to understand exactly what's going on in terms of the schedule. So, anything additional on that front, James?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that of the guys who I've played with that have been frustrated at the end of the season, the biggest reason they get frustrated is they'll have a fantastic, you know, 10 weeks. They'll be first, second in the league. And then they'll have guys that start doing load management. And I hate load management, but at this point, you have to kind of, and we talked about this in our drafting specials leading up to this, but you have to start setting your bar. And this is where being savvy about how your teams are structured, like the teams that your players that you draft from are playing for, and what is the goal of that squad. Because I like numerous instances where guys will, in a fantasy league I play in, they'll be in first place for 10 weeks out of the season, and then all of a sudden they'll have a guy who's on load management and they start resting. And let's just say their team has a 4-game week. They play 2 of those games, and they're a 40-point fantasy producer. That's 80 points that they lose just on load management. So then they started losing towards the end. And then when you hit the playoff stride, fantasy playoffs are still during the regular season of the NBA, and that's when they really start gearing up for the playoffs. So unlike other sports, there's less incentive. If a basketball team's in a good position and they know they're in the playoffs and they're locked in, you can rest guys a lot. You don't see that as much in football just because there's fewer games. So you definitely have to take that into consideration because I've seen it happen over and over and over again. That's a big reason why some people don't come back, because they get frustrated because they feel like, well, I did so good and then all of a sudden it fell apart at the end. Well, that's the nature of the beast. And if you're smart and you plan accordingly, you can actually take advantage of people who didn't do that when load management kicks in, and that's how you kind of surpass them going into the playoffs. That's when you hit your steam. So definitely look at the schedules for sure.
I think this next point is going to be fun to talk about, because I think you and I are going to go about this a little bit differently, and that's who do you look for in the first round. So I would say, first of all, understand your draft position, because picking first and picking fifth are very different, not just because of the player that you get in the first round, but also just the way that the draft works and snakes around. You have to really think about who you're going to be able to acquire in subsequent rounds. So you can't just look at things myopically and say, okay, this is the guy I want in the first. Okay, well, if you're looking down the list and you see that it's going to be really, really guard heavy in the second, do you really want to take a guard in the first? So understand that every draft position is not created the same. They are very, very different. I would suggest going through and doing a lot of different mock drafts, just from a general view, just to see who you think you might be able to snag, not just in the first and second rounds, but throughout the entire draft. So, where do you see these pockets and runs of these players, be it guards or forwards or centers? The worst place to be in a draft is kind of the follower. You always want to be able to lead a draft and start those runs with different players, because let's face it, if you start a good run on guards and then everybody kind of freaks out and takes 5, 6, 7 behind you, you can come back and start the run on forwards in subsequent rounds. So you really do want to understand what you can do from each specific draft position. But beyond that, when we talk about first round players, and this is where I think James and I are going to differ a little bit, I'm fine taking the fat Dick Cheney in the first round. And by that, I mean, I want to take somebody who I know I can count on, somebody who is going to be very, very consistent throughout the season. So I don't want to take one of those high-risk home run players right at the beginning of a draft, because I just don't want to put myself in a position to lose. Now, the only time that would change, and that kind of goes back to one of our other points here, if I know that the players in my league are not going to put in the work, they're not going to put in the effort. Now, granted, I wouldn't play in one of those leagues. I wouldn't, because there's no satisfaction to me in beating up on a lot of people who don't know what they're doing. The only exception to that is when I have my basketball team playing fantasy leagues with me. Then I just enjoy destroying them. I have no problem with that. But you can't set yourself up for failure. And I think that I'm the type of person who wants to create a very balanced team. So I'm going to play it safe in the first few rounds, really, just to make sure that I have some guys that I can count on. Because if I shoot for the moon here in the first round and this guy does not hit the way that I was hoping that he would, uh, you could set yourself up for a long season for sure if you don't get one of those premier players that you can have as a building block. So I don't typically. It's not that I'm risk averse, but I don't typically take a huge risk in the first round. I will count on my ability to work the wire and add other players to my roster and fill out a good solid team that I know is going to be competitive, and then hope that my homework pays off in the later rounds and I get more production from some of those later players. But I'm not going to be the person who, frankly, I'm not going to be the person to take Zion Williamson in the first round. So I'll let somebody else do it. I'll fade him just because I don't necessarily trust him. So for me, after doing this for 16, 17, 18 years, that's always worked because I trust the process in which I go about things, and I know that I'm going to at least be very competitive, and I have faith in my ability to make sound trades, sound maneuvers, sound waiver claims, sound free agency decisions, and be able to put together a team that's going to be competitive at the end.
Yeah, I don't think you and I disagree too much on this. One of the things we talked about during the draft specials essentially was the only difference is I believe the same philosophy you have. I think it's very important to know who you're playing against, how much work are they willing to put in. I'm confident when we get to round 5, 6, and 7 that I can find value that other people won't. Because when you get around 5, 6, and 7 and on, people will take name value. They'll take guys who, produced good 4 or 5 seasons ago, but, they're easily on the decline. And I can tell that I'd rather take somebody else who, like a Montrezl Harrell, for instance. He's not a name guy, but I know what he's going to give me in terms of value. So I'm confident there. So I'm willing to take a risk on a high ceiling guy in the first round. So Anthony Davis is a polarizing figure. Kyrie Irving's kind of the same way. Statistically speaking, they give you a ton. Of the two, let's just use Anthony Davis for the example. I think he's going to have a huge season. I think the Lakers need him to have a huge season. I think he's motivated to have a huge season. But do I have the same concerns that others have about his health? Yes, absolutely. I know Ken doesn't trust him. I know a lot of people don't trust him. I don't necessarily trust him myself. A couple things that I've done, though, is I've accepted the fact that the bar is a little bit lower as far as games played. So if he plays 60 games in a season, there's not going to be a ton of centers that are playing 75 games. So relatively speaking, if somebody takes a center or a star player against my position, I'm not losing out a ton, and I believe that his ceiling is higher than most of these people who are quote-unquote on equal footing. Number one. Number two, I want to know my personnel to know whether or not they're willing to listen to trades and things like that. So I may look to take a guy who's higher risk in the first rounds with a big ceiling just because I can milk him for as much as I can. And before he starts to decline, if I kind of sniff that there might be, potential for an injury, he tweaks something, or load management, I may look to package him and parlay him for two guys that give me 29 to 30 points a game. I get a 1 for 2, and then that covers me if I've got an injured player. Because everybody, look, if you haven't played fantasy before, just accept the fact you're going to have an injury. 1, 2, possibly 3. They're going to be nagging, and some of them you're going to think are just ridiculous because that's how they get around the load management, is by saying, he's got a hamstring thing, or it's an Achilles thing, or a groin thing. So yes, I'm willing to take those risks, but all of that is predicated on what Ken just said, knowing who I'm playing with, kind of determining how much work do I think they're actually putting in, and the confidence that I have in being able to draft guys in the later rounds to protect and insulate that pick. So, and that really kind of covers the next three things we're going to talk about, like how much risk. If you're playing for the first time and you want to have fun, my suggestion to you would be to play guys who play it safe. Play it safe and enjoy, right? Especially if you're not in a big money league. Enjoy what you're doing. And that's got to kind of parlay into one piece of advice, even if you're taking chalk. So we'll move on to the next one. It's how important is it to diversify players from different teams? So we actually have a listener. His name's John, who reached out to us on Twitter. I'm actually going to be in his fantasy league this season, which is going to be interesting because all the things we're saying about knowing the players that you're going against. I mean, we've got guys from all over. I think he's from Texas. We've got people from Canada in this league. So I wouldn't have any clue. So this will literally be blind and me using my best judgment based on the roster. But, one of the conversations that he and I had were really diversifying your rosters, because if you're a fan of a team, so we're Blazers fans, right? I don't want to have a team that has Anthony Simons, Dame, and Nurkic on it, right? As much as you love your squads, make sure you're diversifying, because in weeks where Portland is playing 4 games, fantastic. But if there's a week where they're playing 2 or 3, which is probably going to be 50-50, the 3 and 4, I'm losing a lot of value by having all my eggs in one team's basket. Doesn't mean you're not going to have some double ups, but if your primary points are coming from one squad, just make sure you diversify it. And would you agree with that?
I do agree with that wholeheartedly, save one small aspect of it. About a month before the fantasy playoffs start, I start combing through the NBA schedule, and I know this goes back to a previous point that we had, and I see which teams play and when. So if, for instance, if I see that the Pacers are going to play more times than the other teams in the final week of the season, I may make a play to try to get Tyrese Halliburton and Buddy Hield both. And if I think that I can make it through the first couple of rounds based on the rosters that I have, I'll start setting myself up for championship week. I would say this: don't think that you're going to be able to do that the week before championship week. It's just not going to happen, because people are going to be too smart. They're going to be looking ahead. But if you can do it a few weeks prior, you might be able to snake a guy and get some good value for that final week. Now, obviously, you don't want to blow up your team and get yourself in a position where you can't make the finals, and you have to balance it a little bit. But I think there's some strategy to this too. So I typically don't pair the same players from the same team together at the beginning of a season in a draft, but I will look to do it if I need to later on down the road, if I feel like I can pick somebody up almost as a luxury, and basically keep them away from somebody else as well. So that would be my only exception to it. So diversification is certainly important, but you have to do it with some element of strategy and do it mindfully for sure. So, we put some things in here too about, where to find the most value and late draft strategy. To me, and James, I'll let you speak to this as well, but I look at the late rounds as the time where I'll take my home runs, because I know that I've created a roster through the first, 5, 6, 7, 8 rounds that is going to keep me in the running and in the league. I also don't have things that are so extraordinarily, top heavy that I'm going to be out of it. So I typically have the back end of my roster constructed of some of those home run players, because frankly, if you go through an entire draft and you don't take any risks, you're going to have some of those players who you're going to end up having to drop, who have value to others, who they can subsequently pick up. So I think you take some of those home run players later in drafts, and if they don't pan out, then that's fine. That's who you cut to grab somebody off waivers at 12:01. I think that you have to have some acceptance that you're going to have roster churn at the back end of your roster. So why not, with your last 4 or 5 picks, take some of those guys who you think could really hit it big, and then if they don't, then they're the ones that you churn through. And if they do hit it big, then okay, now you've got some trade bait. You can trade one of those guys for, and here's what I would suggest doing. Take one of those guys and one of those safe players that you have that you took in the 4th round, package them in a 2-for-1, and then you get a more elite player coming back to you, plus you get a roster spot, which a lot of people just don't understand the value of that roster spot. But if you can do some of those 2-for-1s or 3-for-2s with some of those home run guys that you get at the end, that's a really sound strategy in terms of team building. So what are your thoughts on late round strategies, James?
I usually look at, and this is, I try to be as aware and conscious of where teams are headed, like who's playing for the finals, who's playing to make the playoffs, who's playing to improve, what players are playing for contracts. Um, I try to like be involved in all of those things in late rounds. So if I've got a team that I know is racing to the bottom, so if I'm late in drafts, who's going to be getting a lot of minutes? So Darius Basley in Oklahoma City is going to be getting a ton of run this season. I'm looking at rookies who, if like Oklahoma City, San Antonio, Indiana, I mean, teams that really have no incentive to win. I thought it was, this is just a side note for Media Day. I don't know if you saw this, but Greg Popovich, it actually frustrated me because I have a lot of respect for him as a coach, and I think he's just revered throughout the league. But when he made a comment, he said, "I wouldn't go out and bet on us to win the championship." Look,
That's Pop being Pop.
I get it, but like, what kind of message are you sending to your players that you've completely, even if you know they're not set up to win? I'm just shocked from a culture perspective that something like that would come out of his mouth.
My bet is he went back to the locker room with the team and said, "Okay, so I went out there and I said, well, don't put money on us. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to go out and prove everybody wrong because the expectations for us are going to be low. And I know you guys better than that. So we're going to go out and we're going to shock a lot of people coming out this season." Like, he's too competitive of a guy to just go out there and say that and actually believe it. Now, granted, they don't have the greatest roster. Do they have a chance to win the championship? It's minuscule, but Greg Popovich is way too fiery and competitive just to say, well, this is a throw in the towel type of season. So with him, he never says anything that isn't strategic in nature. And there's a reason why he did that. And I think the players likely got together and just kind of had a chuckle about it.
Well, I would hope so, because otherwise, I just question why you stay for an additional season if you're going to tank it. So anyway, so one of the things that I'm looking at is I'm looking at that San Antonio Spurs roster, and I know a lot of guys are going to get run, a lot of touches. Same thing with Oklahoma City. If some pieces get moved in Indiana, I think that's another squad that I like to take guys off of those rosters that are going to get run. A guy who, Amadou Diallo. So when he was with Oklahoma City, I picked him up 2 seasons ago, or maybe was it last season? I can't remember now. But he went on a rip where he was getting me like 42 fantasy points for 7 games in a row. This is leading into a playoff push. He was just playing out of his mind. And those are the types of guys that he's not on anybody's roster, so you can find value there. I like to play around. And like Ken said, it's important to always have 1 to 2 positions that are completely expendable. If you're looking at your roster and these are guys you don't want to move because you have kind of emotional tie to it, you got to scratch that. You got to have 2 positions that are expendable that you can pick guys off the waiver wire as many times as your waiver wire allows to get you games played. Because you just ultimately want points at that spot. So if you're sitting there saying, I love everybody on my roster, I'm not moving anyone, but you get towards playoffs and everybody's playing 3 games and you got 4 waiver options, that's 4 days worth of points that you're leaving on the board. Even if they're not 40 points, it points in general where you need. So I usually kind of play around with squads that you're going to have an opportunity for a lot of run towards the end. So post-draft, once you've picked your roster, obviously I think we discussed that there's different ways to go about it. I don't think there's a wrong way. If there was one and only way, everybody would do it. So that's what I love about fantasy sports, regardless of what you're playing. Post-draft, a couple things, just quick notes on this. Really work your waiver wire. Be diligent, because you're going to have times where somebody's going to have a hot season that no one knows about, because they're going to get their first opportunity. You need to make sure that you're paying attention to things like that and snag him, because there are instances like Diallo where you end up picking a guy. I mean, Jeremy Lin, when that whole Linsanity thing happened in New York, that was a waiver wire guy. Nobody had Jeremy Lin in their initial rosters when he was playing in New York. He went on a rip and just absolutely, he was a differentiator in multiple weeks as far as points for players who picked him up off the waiver wire. You're going to have stories like that every single season. Be diligent, be the first to know, and grab him early. Even if that means you got to get up at 12:01 based on where you are in the waiver order. And you and I both know we've done that a fair share. I mean, hell, the last time we played together, I think you and I raced, and you snagged a couple guys, and I was so irritated that at 12:01 and 32 seconds, and I look, and Ken already picked him up.
Well, yeah, I've been known to set my alarm just in case I fall asleep, just to wake up at 11:55, and I will legitimately have 3 different computers on and ready to hit submit on all of them in different leagues and just go bang, bang, bang. And sometimes you have to do that. And now certainly you have to figure out what's going to be best for your league. If it's a first come, first serve system, if there's a waiver process, whatever it might be. But, I think that's what makes it fun. And quite honestly, at the end of the year, when you win a league, you feel like you've gone back and you've earned it. So that's what makes fantasy fun. Certainly it's the ability to, beat your friends and, snagging that player off. It's funny. I actually put out a poll years ago. It was a fantasy football poll, but I'm sure it rings true in fantasy basketball as well. What's more satisfying to you, picking up a sleeper player off waivers who hits and becomes a player with top 3 round value, or winning a championship? And overwhelmingly, people said that picking up that player off waivers is more satisfying. And I think the reason being is there's always an element of luck when it comes to winning a fantasy league. But when you grab that guy who hits, you feel like that's more of a skillful, mindful decision that you made. And frankly, you feel like you're smarter than everybody else. So that's a fun part of it for sure. So we're going to talk a lot about draft strategies, more on what to do, how to approach trades in upcoming episodes of the show. We're going to do tons of mock drafts and talk about strategies at the turn and what to do here and what to do there in subsequent episodes as well. So we're going to talk a lot about this. Is certainly not the end of the discussion. We're going to have lots of information on how to go about your draft and how to win. So James, parting shots today before we move forward?
No, just a reminder that the season actually starts on Friday, so we have an exhibition game in Abu Dhabi. The Bucks are playing the Hawks. It's our first taste of NBA action.
Right, and that's Friday. So
Friday.
To you, that would be October 1st, correct?
That would be Q4.
Right, so yes, the end of the quarter, right? Okay, so for Matthew McConaughey, Christian Bale, James Fraley, Fat Dick Cheney, and myself, Ken Kelly, we'll see you next time on the Fantasy Basketball Podcast.